In the early years of World War II, Adolf Hitler and his generals looked across the Atlantic and saw a nation they believed was unprepared for modern war. To them, America was a sleeping giant, wealthy, yes, but soft. A country of businessmen and farmers, more interested in baseball games and consumer luxuries than in tanks, guns, and armies. When German panzer divisions smashed through France in 1940, when Britain struggled to hold on by the skin of its teeth, the Nazis laughed at the idea that the United States could ever pose a serious challenge. German intelligence reports painted a dismissive picture. America's army was small, its weapons outdated, and its tank production almost non-existent. In fact, before the war, the U.S. military had fewer than 500 usable tanks. Compared to Germany's mighty panzer force, America looked hopelessly behind. Hitler's officers smirked. If America entered the war, they assumed, its soldiers would march into battle in outdated machines, easy prey for German firepower. But what Hitler and his generals failed to understand was the incredible power of American industry and the determination of a nation that had been underestimated too many times before. When the United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, everything changed overnight. The sleeping giant awoke, and with it came a level of industrial mobilization the world had never seen. Factories that once built cars, refrigerators, and farm equipment suddenly switched to building tanks, planes, and artillery. Ordinary citizens, men and women alike, poured into assembly lines. The entire economy bent toward one purpose: defeating the Axis powers. The numbers that followed were staggering. In just 3 years, America produced nearly 50,000 tanks, more than the combined wartime output of Germany. Factories like Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant became legendary, churning out armored vehicles at a pace that shocked even the most experienced military planners. Where Germany's tank factories were small, limited, and vulnerable to Allied bombing, American production seemed limitless. This transformation was so rapid and so massive that when German officers first received reports, they refused to believe them. How could a country that barely had an armored force in 1939 suddenly flood Europe with tens of thousands of tanks by 1944? To them, it seemed impossible. Yet as American forces landed in North Africa, rolled into Italy, and later stormed the beaches of Normandy, the proof was undeniable. But in those first months of mobilization, the story was not yet clear. America was racing against time. The U.S. had to prove, to its allies and to its enemies, that it could do the impossible. Tank factories were running around the clock, workers were trained at record speed, and engineers were asked to design, test, and mass-produce machines with almost no time to spare. Mistakes were made, shortcuts were taken, but the sheer scale of output covered those flaws. For German generals, who had once sneered at American weakness, the sight of endless convoys of Sherman tanks rolling off ships in Europe was like a nightmare made real. They had expected weakness. What they faced instead was industrial might unlike anything they had ever encountered. The story of those 50,000 tanks is not just about steel and machines. It is about a nation that turned its entire way of life toward one mission. Housewives who had never worked a day in a factory became skilled welders. Farmers who once repaired tractors now assembled engines for Shermans. School teachers left classrooms to work night shifts riveting steel plates. America didn't just build tanks, it built an unstoppable war machine fueled by unity, determination, and industry. And as the first American tanks rolled into battle, Hitler's officers, once so confident, began to realize their mistake. They had laughed at the idea of American power. Now, they would be forced to reckon with it on the battlefield. The United States had entered the war with urgency, but in 1942, one enormous challenge stood in front of them, turning promises of tanks into actual steel giants ready for combat. The German high command scoffed at American claims, confident that the Americans were simply bluffing. After all, designing and mass-producing a tank wasn't the same as building cars or tractors. The panzer divisions of Germany had been forged through years of warfare, refined with battlefield experience. How could a nation with almost no modern armor tradition compete? But what the Nazis underestimated was America's ability to innovate and organize on a scale they could never match. President Franklin Roosevelt's government launched what came to be known as the arsenal of democracy. Civilian industries across the nation were repurposed almost overnight. Automakers like Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, companies that once filled America's highways with cars, now turned their massive plants toward building war machines. Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant became the crown jewel of this transformation. Designed to be the largest tank production facility in the world, it began operation in 1941 and quickly set records for output. Imagine a single factory, larger than many towns, working day and night to assemble thousands of Sherman tanks. By mid-war, the plant was producing one complete tank every 38 minutes. German officers couldn't believe such reports. Their own tank industry, centered around smaller workshops and slower processes, struggled to keep pace. Germany built advanced machines like the Tiger and Panther tanks, technically superior in armor and firepower, but their production was limited. Each Tiger took weeks to assemble, often requiring hand craftsmanship. America, by contrast, focused on volume, speed, and reliability. The Sherman might not win every duel in a head-to-head fight, but there would always be more Shermans than German tanks to face. Behind the numbers were people, ordinary Americans who became extraordinary contributors. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Known as Rosie the Riveters, they welded, riveted, and assembled tank hulls, while their husbands and brothers fought overseas. For many, it was their first time working in heavy industry, yet within months they mastered the skills needed to produce machines of war. Black Americans, often relegated to lower-paying jobs before the war, also joined the effort, fighting for equality in the factories, even as they built the weapons of democracy. This wasn't just industry. It was national mobilization on a historic scale. Schools trained mechanics. Universities hosted crash courses for engineers. Newspapers ran ads urging citizens to conserve rubber, gasoline, and metals for the war effort. Children collected scrap. Farmers sent raw materials, and everyone felt connected to the fight. The tank rolling out of the Detroit Arsenal wasn't just the product of steel and bolts. It was the product of a united nation. Meanwhile, German intelligence officers scrambled to make sense of the figures. Could it really be true that America, a country they had mocked as lazy and decadent, was producing tanks at 10 times the rate of the Reich? Some German generals dismissed the reports as propaganda. Others grew deeply concerned. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring reportedly warned that if America could sustain such production, the war on the Western Front would eventually become unwinnable. By the end of 1942, American tanks were already arriving in North Africa, helping British forces fight Rommel's Afrika Korps. Though the early battles revealed flaws in the Sherman design, thin armor, a gun that struggled against German panzers, what mattered most was that reinforcements kept coming. For every Sherman destroyed, more arrived within weeks. For every setback, American industry answered with overwhelming replacements. This was the first time German officers began to sense the scale of what they were facing. The Tiger tank might dominate in a duel, but what happens when a single Tiger faces 5, 10, or even 20 Shermans? The math was grim. The Reich's factories could never keep up with this flood. By the close of 1942, it was clear America had not just entered the war, it had transformed it. The tide of steel was rising, and with it, the fate of Hitler's empire would slowly begin to crumble. By 1943, the pace of American tank production was not just astonishing. It was terrifying to German commanders watching from across the Atlantic. The United States had crossed the threshold from promise to reality. Assembly lines that once turned out sedans and trucks now rolled out Sherman tanks by the thousands. And the scale of it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois thundered day and night. The noise of hammering steel, grinding engines, and clanging assembly lines filled the air. Entire cities seemed to beat to the rhythm of the war machine. A tank was no longer the product of months of careful handcrafting as it was in Germany. It was the product of conveyor belts, interchangeable parts, and relentless organization. For Hitler's generals, the shock came not only from the numbers, but also from the speed at which America adapted. In just a matter of months, Detroit had become the tank city of the world. German officers, used to hearing that their country was the master of engineering, couldn't understand how the Americans had leapfrogged into dominance so quickly. But the truth was clear. While Germany valued precision and complexity, America valued scale and efficiency. A Tiger tank was a mechanical marvel, weighing nearly 60 tons, boasting an 88mm gun that could destroy a Sherman at long range. Yet each Tiger cost the equivalent of several Shermans to build, required far more raw materials, and took months to complete. By the time a Tiger rolled onto the battlefield, dozens of Shermans had already been shipped overseas, ready for combat. But America's strength wasn't just in factories. It was in logistics, the invisible battlefield where wars are truly won. Trains carried tanks from the heartland to coastal ports. Ships, sometimes carrying hundreds of vehicles at once, crossed dangerous seas to North Africa, Britain, and eventually Normandy. What stunned the Germans was not only that the Americans built 50,000 tanks, it was that they had the power to move them across the globe at will. The system was so efficient that tanks destroyed in battle could often be replaced within weeks. Soldiers on the front lines, battered but still holding the line, would watch with amazement as new convoys arrived, bringing fresh armor and equipment. This constant flow of reinforcements gave Allied forces something priceless: confidence. They knew they wouldn't run out of tanks. German troops, on the other hand, felt the opposite. Tank divisions often waited for replacement Panthers or Tigers that never came. Factories in Germany struggled under relentless Allied bombing campaigns. Rail lines were destroyed. Fuel was scarce. Even when new tanks were built, getting them to the front lines was a nightmare. By contrast, the Americans seemed to have an endless supply. One German officer later recalled how demoralizing it was to face an enemy who could replace everything we destroyed. The battlefield became a numbers game, and America's numbers were overwhelming. But it wasn't only about numbers. The Sherman, though mocked at first, had qualities that made it invaluable. It was reliable. It didn't break down as often as German tanks. It was lighter, which meant it could cross bridges that Tigers and Panthers could not. It could be transported easily on ships and railways. Its engine could be repaired quickly in the field, with spare parts that were always available. And then there was the human factor. American crews quickly learned how to fight in teams, using their numbers to overwhelm heavier German tanks. Instead of one Sherman challenging a Tiger head-on, 4 or 5 would coordinate to outflank it. American doctrine emphasized mobility and cooperation, turning what seemed like a weakness into a deadly advantage. By mid-1943, the reports reaching Berlin painted a grim picture. Hitler's officers, once laughing at the Sherman as a rolling coffin, now admitted that its real danger wasn't in individual battles, but in the sheer flood that kept pouring onto the battlefield. The German High Command, for the first time, began to grasp the true scale of the American war machine. This was no longer the United States of 1941, a country untested and unprepared. This was an industrial giant, fully awake, and fully committed to smashing the Reich. By 1944, the storm that America had unleashed was in full force. In the skies, Allied bombers pounded German factories relentlessly, cutting deep into the Reich's ability to produce weapons. But on the ground, in Britain and beyond, an avalanche of American armor was gathering for a decisive moment: the liberation of Europe. In vast British fields, thousands of Sherman tanks stood ready, lined up row after row, like an ocean of steel. For villagers nearby, it was a surreal sight. Once quiet meadows, now filled with machines of war. Soldiers trained tirelessly, rehearsing maneuvers, learning how to coordinate infantry, artillery, and armor into one crushing blow. German intelligence reports reached Berlin with alarming frequency. Scouts, spies, and reconnaissance planes confirmed what Hitler's officers dreaded. The Americans were not just producing tanks in unimaginable numbers. They were preparing to unleash them in an invasion that could overwhelm Fortress Europe. The contrast was stark. On the German side, factories like Henschel and Kassel or Mann in Nuremberg struggled to produce a few dozen heavy tanks per month. Each Panther or Tiger rolled out with great effort, consuming precious resources and man-hours. Worse still, Allied bombing raids disrupted production constantly, forcing factories underground or into makeshift shelters. Supply chains were in chaos. Meanwhile, American plants like the Detroit Arsenal tank plant churned out hundreds of Shermans monthly. With standardized parts, simple designs, and an industrial system geared for mass production, the United States could replace losses faster than the Germans could inflict them. It was a war of attrition, and America's hand was stacked with endless cards. In Normandy, when the invasion finally came on June 6, 1944, the scale of Allied logistics left German commanders in disbelief. The beaches became a floodgate for American armor. Within days, Sherman tanks were rolling through hedgerows, pushing inland, and steadily grinding down German defenses. The Wehrmacht's worst fears were coming true. The tank armies they had scoffed at were now materializing before their eyes, and in numbers they could not match. To German tank crews, the sight was haunting. They might destroy one Sherman, perhaps two or three, but more always came. Every village, every crossroads seemed to bring fresh waves of American armor. German soldiers began to describe the Shermans not as individual enemies, but as a tide, inevitable, relentless, and unstoppable. Even more devastating was America's ability to adapt. When German tanks proved superior in firepower, the Allies developed upgrades, like the 76mm gun variant of the Sherman, or the British Firefly, which mounted a deadly 17-pounder capable of piercing the thick armor of a Tiger at long range. Suddenly, even the heavy German tanks, once thought invincible, were being knocked out with alarming regularity. But beyond the battlefield, what truly shocked German officers was the sheer organization behind it all. Every Sherman that reached France represented not just steel and firepower, but an invisible army of workers, engineers, dock workers, and logisticians. America had transformed warfare into a system, a machine that extended from Detroit assembly lines to the hedgerows of Normandy. One German general, after witnessing the Allies' progress in France, wrote bitterly, "We fight against not an army, but against an entire factory." It was no exaggeration. The front lines were merely the final stage of an industrial process that dwarfed anything Germany could muster. By late summer, the Sherman had become the face of Allied momentum. French villagers greeted them as liberators. British and Canadian divisions used them alongside American units, and entire armored columns stretched for miles across Europe. What Hitler's officers once dismissed as inferior had become the spearhead of their enemy's advance. The laughter that once echoed in German war rooms about the so-called Tommy Cooker had long since vanished. In its place was a grim realization. America had weaponized not just its factories, but its entire society. From farmers growing wheat to feed workers, to women riveting steel in assembly plants, to dockhands loading ships at midnight. Every element of American life contributed to this tidal wave of armor. And the Reich, exhausted, battered, and increasingly isolated, simply had no answer. As the summer of 1944 turned into autumn, the shock of America's industrial might grew heavier on the shoulders of Germany's officers. The Wehrmacht had survived the brutal hedgerow fighting of Normandy, only to be pushed back relentlessly. Behind every American infantry division came an endless stream of Shermans. It seemed that for every German tank destroyed, 5 more Shermans appeared on the battlefield. The German generals were veterans of armored warfare. They had pioneered Blitzkrieg in 1940, crushing France with their panzer divisions and earning a reputation for invincibility. But by 1944, they were forced to admit that the tables had turned. The Americans had learned fast, adapted faster, and now wielded resources the Reich could not hope to match. For German crews, the battlefield had become a nightmare. The Sherman was not invincible, but it didn't need to be. Its advantage was not in one-to-one duels, but in the sheer scale of its deployment. A Tiger might hold a village, but eventually dozens of Shermans would encircle it, forcing the crew to abandon or destroy their prized machine. German officers realized that even their best weapons could not keep pace with America's production. What haunted them most was the knowledge of where this tide came from. Reports circulated among the officer corps of America's vast factories. Some officers had seen them firsthand before the war, visiting Ford's River Rouge plant or the massive steel mills of Pittsburgh. They knew America's capabilities, but Hitler had dismissed such warnings. He had laughed at the idea that democracy, a system he considered weak, could outproduce his totalitarian Reich. Now, those doubts and warnings came back to torment his generals. By 1944, America was producing tanks faster than Germany could replace losses of rifles. The numbers were staggering. In the 3 years since Pearl Harbor, the United States had built more than 50,000 tanks, alongside nearly 300,000 aircraft, millions of rifles, and thousands of ships. German officers compared this avalanche to their own situation, where shortages of fuel, steel, and rubber forced tanks to sit idle or factories to halt production altogether. The logistical miracle supporting the Sherman was equally shocking. American supply convoys crossed the Atlantic at a relentless pace, bringing fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. By the time the Allies pushed through France, mechanics were repairing Shermans at roadside depots within hours. A knocked-out tank was not necessarily lost. Often it was recovered, patched up, and sent back into battle. To German officers, this was unthinkable. In their world, a destroyed tank was gone forever. In private conversations, many officers admitted that they had underestimated the American way of war. They had assumed America would fight like France or Britain, hesitant, cautious, and slow to adapt. Instead, America fought with energy, speed, and above all, numbers. One general grimly remarked, "They make war as they make automobiles." The battlefield in France drove this truth home every day. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy and swept across the French countryside, columns of Shermans seemed endless. Civilians cheered them as liberators, while German soldiers cursed them as a symbol of inevitability. Town after town fell, roads clogged with burning panzers, and still the Shermans came. The laughter that once filled Hitler's war councils was gone. In its place, silence. The officers now understood that they were fighting against a power that had fused technology, manpower, and industry into a single machine of war. For the first time, some even whispered the unthinkable. That victory was no longer possible. It was not just the tanks. It was what the tanks represented. Each Sherman was proof that America could pour resources into the war indefinitely. German factories could build marvels like the Tiger or Panther. But in the end, America had chosen the wiser path, simpler designs in massive numbers. A strategy not of prestige, but of practicality. And as the generals watched their maps covered in red arrows pushing deeper into the Reich, they realized the truth. Their enemy was not just the Allied armies. It was the arsenal of democracy itself. When the war finally ended in 1945, America's tank production stood as one of the most remarkable industrial achievements in history. More than 50,000 Sherman tanks had rolled off the assembly lines, an output that no other nation, not even Germany with all its engineering brilliance, could match. But the true impact went beyond just numbers. The American method of standardized mass production became a model for the future. Instead of building the most complex or technologically advanced machine, the U.S. focused on building a weapon that could be produced quickly, repaired easily, and deployed in overwhelming strength. The Sherman tank may not have been perfect. It lacked the thick armor of a Tiger or the devastating gun of a Panther. But when supported by thousands of aircraft, artillery, and a steady flow of replacements, it became an unstoppable force. For Hitler's officers, the shock was not just the quality of American tanks, but the relentless flood of them. Every time the Germans destroyed a Sherman, 2 more seemed to appear the next day. In the end, this industrial avalanche didn't just win battles. It reshaped warfare itself. The world had witnessed a new kind of power. A nation's factories could be as decisive as its armies. By the time the war was over, America's factories had proven just as decisive as its soldiers. The Sherman tank, mocked by German generals as a Tommy Cooker, became the iron backbone of Allied victories across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. It wasn't about having the biggest gun or the thickest armor. It was about endurance, numbers, and momentum. While Germany produced a few thousand heavy tanks, America's assembly lines never stopped moving. Day and night workers, many of them women who had never set foot in a factory before, kept building. And those machines kept rolling onto the battlefield. Hitler's officers, once confident in their technological superiority, came to a sobering realization. They were fighting not just an army, but an entire nation's industrial might. This was the essence of Roosevelt's promise, the arsenal of democracy. A promise that the United States would outproduce, outsupply, and outlast the Axis powers. In the end, the story of 50,000 Shermans is not just about steel and fire. It's about what happens when a country unites its people, its industries, and its willpower toward a single goal. And it serves as a lasting reminder. Wars are not only won on the battlefield. They are won in the factories, the shipyards, and the hearts of ordinary citizens who refuse to give up